Okay, we're going to continue on with the Unit 5 review, looking at numbers 7 through 10. So number 7 through 10 is asking, actually you should say not 7 and 10, but 7 through 10. Find the inverse functions and then restrict the domain if needed. Don't forget that when you restrict the domain, we're only restricting the domain if it's quadratic. Okay? And if you look at all these equations, that's cubic, that's a square root. That one right there, x squared, that's the quadratic. This one is a cube root. So the only one we'll restrict the domain on is number 9. Okay? All right, so let's take a look at number 7. There's no restricting the domain. We're strictly finding the inverse. The first step in finding the inverse is to switch x and y. So right now this is f of x, but that technically is my y. So I'm going to change that to be an x. I'm going to change this x to be the y. And now I still have to solve for y. So your first step is to add 3 to the other side. So you have x plus 3 equals y cubed. And then to get rid of the cube, we're going to take the cube root. And there is no plus or minus for the cube root. So the cube root of x plus 3 equals y. But we're going to write it in function notation. So we're going to write the inverse notation. And that equals the cube root of x plus 3. Okay, let's take a look at number 8. So number 8, we have a square root function, so we do not need to restrict the domain, only for quadratics, which is x squared. This is a square root. So f of x is really your y, so we're going to change that to be an x, and then change this x to be a y. So you switch x and y, but you're not done. You have to get the y by itself. So that means I'm going to subtract 2 first. So I have x minus 2 equals the square root of y minus 1. In order to get rid of a square root, we're going to square both sides. And if I square both sides, I have x minus 2 squared equals, and the square and square root cancel, so we have just y minus 1. And I'm just going to add 1. Now, if you want to, you can multiply this x minus 2 squared out. Just remember it doesn't shower the power because it's a minus sign. You only shower the power when it's multiplication. So this would be x squared minus 4x plus 4. There's a middle term. It's not x squared minus 4. It is not. So actually it's easier just to leave it like this, just in case you make that mistake. So x minus 2 squared plus 1 equals y, but we're going to write it in function notation. So I'm going to use the inverse notation here to denote that it is the inverse, and this is just in vertex form. Okay, number 9. This one is a quadratic. So this one is the one where I am going to have to restrict the domain. And if you remember, in restricting the domain, it's looking at the x value of the vertex, which is at 0. So we're going to restrict the domain. Restrict the domain of this f of x to be x such that x is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? And then we won't have to deal with any plus or minuses. All right, let's go ahead and start off. Change this f of x to an x, then 1/8, change the x to be a y, and that's the first step in finding the inverse, switching x and y, but we still have to solve for y. So I'm going to add 3 first. So we have x plus 3 equals 1/8 y squared. To get rid of the 1/8, I'm going to multiply both sides by 8. So the 8 and the 1/8 cancel. You could technically distribute this if you want to. I will go ahead and be consistent with the answer. So I'm going to cheat here real quick and see if I wrote it that way. Yeah, I did not multiply that out. So I'm just going to leave it as 8 times x plus 3 equals y squared. And to get rid of the square, we're going to take the square root. Now, normally you would have plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides, but because of the fact that this is restricted to be greater than or equal to 0, we do not want any negatives, so we're just going to keep it positive. Now, this right here, this 8, it does break down, and we're going to simplify that. So 8 breaks down to 4 times 2, and 4 breaks down to 2 times 2. So I have a pair of 2's, that'll go outside. I have this leftover 2, that's going to stay inside. So the 2 is on the outside. The square root of 2 goes inside. In x plus 3, you can't simplify that, so it's going to stay inside. And then the last step is to write it in the correct notation. So the inverse of f is 2 times the square root of 2x plus 3. And you could distribute the 2 inside if you'd like to. All right, let's go.